world's attention has been on the crisis in Japan since Friday, but unrest is smoldering across the Middle East. Secretary of State Hillary Clinton was in Egypt Tuesday, making her first visit since President Hosni Mubarak was overthrown. Clinton urged Egyptians to continue their push toward democracy. In Libya, forces loyal to Muammar Gaddafi got closer to stamping out the rebellion. The military routed opposition forces in Ajabia, leaving the eastern city of Benghazi as the last rebel stronghold. A resolution to establish a no-fly zone over Libya is working its way through the UN. And the situation in Bahrain is turning into a showdown between rival states in the Persian Gulf. Saudi troops entered the country Monday to put down a Shiite uprising and protect the ruling Sunni monarchy. The incursion was denounced by Iran and Hezbollah. At least 2 protesters and 1 Saudi soldier have been killed in those clashes. For more now, we are joined in Washington by Daniel Levy. He is part of the Middle East Task Force for the New American Foundation. Daniel, thanks for being with us.
Thank you, Betty.
Let's start in Bahrain. Here is what the White House is saying about the situation there. Take a listen.
We urge the parties involved here and the governments involved to engage in the political dialogue that is necessary to respond to the grievances and the desires of the people of Bahrain, and that's a call that we make to other governments in the region as well.
Okay, so the United States isn't necessarily calling on Saudi Arabia to remove its troops. It seems as though the U.S. has an interest in keeping Bahrain's royal family in charge for now. What's going on?
First of all, to refer to these as both sides is a little belying of the realities. There's a huge asymmetry in power between the Shia community, especially trying to be enfranchised. They're currently disenfranchised, and the ruling monarchy. I think, Betty, the situation in Bahrain is perhaps the most tricky one for the U.S. It brings in issues of energy security, especially as nuclear power will undoubtedly become less popular. It's the home for the U.S. Navy's 5th Fleet. Bahrain is an ally. Of course, Saudi next door, and with its troops now inside Bahrain, is also an ally. On the other side, you have the values piece of this. Democracy, being on the right side. Bahrain's prime minister has been there since 1971. So I think here the question is, can you marry interests, realism, with some ethics and values? Right now, that's proven very difficult to do. I think the U.S. needs to get out ahead of this and do the right thing and distance itself, despite how difficult that's going to be, from what the Bahrainis and the Saudis are doing there right now.
Daniel, you named some of the players in this. Let's talk briefly about Iran and Hezbollah. What is their stake in this conflict in Bahrain?
Well, I think what they see here is a crisis-tunity, a crisis that they can turn into an opportunity, because the tension in Bahrain has this ethnic religious coloring to it, a 70% majority Shia population, as I said, without real political rights or representation. They are going to jump on this bandwagon if it can make their adversaries, and principally the U.S., look bad, because the U.S. seems to be on the wrong side. The Shia community in Bahrain does not necessarily or naturally align itself with Iran. If we get this wrong, if the Bahraini and Saudi leadership get this wrong, then they may well push the Shia community inside Bahrain to reach out to their co-religionists as a last resort in Iran. And that's why it risks getting very tricky and very ugly, this element of involving Iran. I think we should not overemphasize, we should not indulge this idea that Iran provides such a threat. I think we sometimes exaggerate that and we play into Iran's hands.
All right, I want to shift gears now and turn to Libya for a moment, because a few days ago, and this is very important, the rebels were poised to move in on Tripoli, but now they've been driven back to Benghazi. Has the time passed to establish a no-fly zone? I mean, what hope does the opposition have at this point?
I think you're absolutely right, Betty. I think the conversations going on in Washington and at the United Nations are yesterday's conversations. This is not about a no-fly zone. It was a tricky prospect anyway. It would have involved the kind of American intervention which is really rather discredited after the Iraq War. But I think the situation today is that this is about artillery, it's about tanks, it's about missiles, things that a no-fly zone would not address. The question is, are there other steps you can take? Can you jam Gaddafi's communications? Can you help make sure that the rebel side has something of a fighting chance in terms of ability to get weapons to them? Can there be a serious arms embargo against Gaddafi? Now, I know that risks arming one side in a civil war, but I think the question today is what can be done without military intervention to give the rebels a chance of holding on to Benghazi, their one important remaining stronghold, which might allow them to regroup and to have a chance against Gaddafi. There's clearly a will amongst the Libyan people to remove Gaddafi. We don't want to see him stay in office, and we don't want to see what happens in Libya begin a counter-revolutionary, counter-democratic trend, where after success in Egypt and Tunisia, you now see Libya, Yemen, Bahrain, where leaders push back hard and militarily against the democratic opposition and succeed, and that's what one has to prevent.
But, you know, it seems like a lot of faith in the rebels has started to wane because they are losing ground. I mean, what chance do they stand at this point?
Well, I think the first thing to acknowledge is just how vastly outgunned they are. Gaddafi has access to huge wealth, to armaments, but it doesn't mean that his is an undefeatable side. And I think the question today is, does one basically write this off and say Gaddafi's going to stay in power? Maybe one will do sanctions, but we saw that in Iraq sanctions didn't work. They took 12 years and still didn't work. Or does one say, let's create conditions in which the rebels have a fighting chance without ourselves, as the United States, getting involved militarily? I think that there are options to explore on that second track, where one can try and give the rebels a chance to hold Benghazi, to regroup, and to set about the task of building, which they didn't do in Libya. This really happened overnight. There wasn't the build-up of the opposition that there was over many years in Tunisia and Egypt. And if you can have Benghazi as a stronghold, you might be able to build a serious challenge to Gaddafi, but give it more time.
All right, well, let me put this scenario out there. What happens if he doesn't lose power? What happens if he does overcome the rebels? What happens then?
Well, I think then you are stuck with a Gaddafi that's, with a Libya rather, that is still led by General Gaddafi. Undoubtedly, there would be various sanctions put in place. I don't think they'd have such an effect. I think what you do, Betty, under those circumstances, is you assist in whatever way, but not publicly, quietly, you assist in whatever way you can and get neighboring countries to assist over time the rebuilding of an opposition to Gaddafi that will challenge Gaddafi, and you give it time to build on the inside of Libya. It sends a terrible signal to the rest of the region. It may be the eventuality we're facing. If it's clear that there are massacres going on, then I think it changes the equation, and then I think intervention becomes the only option.
All right. Well, we do appreciate your information, Daniel Levy from the New America Foundation. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Betty.